this recording in the meeting chat or on Microsoft Teams. I think we're recording now, so. All right, you see the presentation?
Yep.
Okay, I'm gonna start. 3, 2, 1. Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's Science Festival with Waukesha County Parks and Land Use. Our topic this morning is busting backyard invasives. My name is Julia Robson. I am the conservation biologist for Waukesha County Parks and Land Use, and my co-host this morning is Samantha Kaiser. She is our natural land management specialist for the parks. And we're thrilled to be presenting this with you today because it's an important topic and it also consumes a lot of our job annually, every single year in the parks. We do a lot of habitat restoration, which fully encompasses invasive species control in the park system. And this is a topic right out of the gates, we'll admit, could probably be a 2 full day course, field course, for anyone that's tuning in and watching this. And we've condensed it down to essentially a 10 to 15 minute presentation. So it's very much going to be an overview of how you can approach invasive species management in your backyards, on your property. But there are a lot of resources out there to further your learning on this topic. We would encourage you to consider coming out to volunteer with our staff in the parks on habitat restoration work days, where you'll get to see firsthand some of these techniques we'll talk about today. You get to do identification firsthand in the field. And there's also a lot of online resources that we will provide to you as part of this presentation. So I won't go too in depth on that just now, but I will in a little bit here. So let's dive right in. Most people do know what an invasive species is, but for those of you that aren't entirely familiar with them yet, invasive species are essentially defined as alien species whose introduction does or is likely to cause economic, environmental harm, or harm to human health. And this essentially means that a particular species did not evolve within the region that you're referring to. So if we're talking about Wisconsin, these are species that, say, came from Eurasia or other regions of our globe, but it also includes species that are from within the United States, or say from within North America, that have been introduced outside of their native range. An example of this is a species such as the red swamp crayfish, which is down on the bottom right there. That's a species that you'll find in the United States, native in the South, but it was introduced outside of its range and has caused a lot of issues outside of its native range, where it is considered an invasive species, including introductions in Wisconsin that to date have been effectively controlled. So that is the technical definition of what an invasive species is. So how did they get here? How did this start to become a problem? A lot of introductions occurred with the boom and growth of international commerce. A lot of us have heard of the emerald ash borer, pictured there. It has wreaked havoc on our native ash trees. We have lost millions upon millions of ash trees within the Midwest and the Northeast. This particular small penny-sized green boring beetle made its way over here in the packing materials from shipping cargo coming from China. So international commerce and the ability to just move goods, including organisms, across the globe really facilitated introductions for non-native species. But it's important to know, even in the United States, if you consider it, we have over 50,000 non-native species that have been brought here, but only a fraction of introductions of species, only a fraction of those species actually become what we would consider an invasive species, less than 1%. So some of them just fulfill unoccupied niches and they don't cause much disturbance. And if anything, they temporarily add to the biodiversity within a region, but they don't cause any economic, environmental harm to that area. And today we're at a point where over 20% of flora and fauna within most countries are consisting of non-native species. And it's something we care about because there are impacts from these introductions and from the establishment of invasive species. The main one being is that they displace our native species. So often what you see with highly invasive species are monocultures, just single stands of buckthorn, single stands of honeysuckle. They have a lot of advantages and mechanisms for success that we'll talk about here in a minute that allow them to outcompete our native species on a landscape. They also reduce and degrade wildlife habitat. As you can imagine, a highly diverse forest or prairie with multiple native species with all different blooming times is a very valuable piece of habitat for wildlife. But when you have invasive species infestations, it degrades that habitat, especially if it shifts, from a very diverse system with many species to almost a single stand of one species. They can also cause direct mortality. That picture on the bottom right there is a golden crowned kinglet. That's a bird that's migrating through right now in fall. It got caught up in the burrs of common burdock, which is an invasive plant we deal here with on the landscape. They alter ecosystem processes, some of these. They can alter hydrology in wetlands, sometimes even drying them completely up, like reed canary grass or giant reed grass, pictured there at the bottom. There are economic impacts. Property values can decrease. Imagine having a beautiful lakefront home or a riverfront home, and your shoreline becomes infested with 12 to 16 foot tall giant reed grass, again pictured there on the bottom. So there are economic impacts, especially the amount of money we spend on mitigating the effects of invasives every year, aesthetics, and there are some threats to human health. Wild parsnip pictured there on the top left. It's got a yellow umbel flower. You probably saw it blooming on the sides of our highways and roadways this summer. If you come into contact with this plant, the oils on it that you can pick up are photoreactive, and you can actually get rashes and boils, and it can be a complete nightmare to deal with. And the reason these species flourish outside of their range sometimes are several. It's several facets to it. One of them being that invasive species tend to have phenological advantages over our native species. So invasive species, more often than not, are the first to leaf out in the spring, and they're the last to lose their leaves in fall. You're seeing this right now. A lot of buckthorn is still bright green in the understory, and our native trees and shrubs have all started to turn for fall and drop their foliage. So they are competing for resources longer throughout the growing season than a lot of our native species are, basically giving them an edge up. They have rapid reproduction, so they grow quickly, they spread seed very easily, high dispersal ability, and a lot of their seed, let's look at teasel, for example, on the right there. That plant right there can produce about 2,000 seeds. Of those seeds, the viability of them, so the likelihood that they'll germinate into another plant, can range anywhere from 30 to 80%. So the rate of spread can be very high. Additionally, some invasive species are allelopathic. Buckthorn and garlic mustard exhibit this characteristic where they can release biological compounds into the growing medium around them, essentially making it inhospitable for other species to grow with them. And then last but certainly not least, as you can imagine, these species being introduced outside of their native range where they evolved within that ecosystem have no natural predators. So there's no diseases or pests or herbivory predators that are keeping the populations of these non-native species in check within their introduced ranges. So they're basically able to flourish in addition to all of these other advantages that we just mentioned. So when it comes to tackling invasive species in your own yard and on your property, one of the first steps we recommend is just know what you have out there. There's a lot of resources out there to help you figure out, do I have an invasive species on my property? One of them being NR40. Wisconsin actually has an invasive species rule that was established. So it lists all invasive species found within the state. It categorizes them based on being prohibited or restricted. So prohibited species are the real big deal ones that we absolutely have to deal with. Restricted species are species that, yes, they're invasive, but they're already well established in the state. So you're not necessarily required to do anything about it, but you can still and you should still try and address them where appropriate. So the Wisconsin DNR has the NR40 page hosted on their website with lists of invasives, resources to help identify them. And it's important to note, too, that there's other applications you can use at home for free, such as Seek or iNaturalist. So you can use your handy dandy phones now to help you identify plants in the field, native and non-native. And this is an important step because it helps you to plan and prioritize the effort that you might be considering taking towards controlling invasives on your property. Certain invasives you might want to focus on first over others if you have them both on your landscape. So knowing what's out there is very important. And knowing what you have helps you understand the phenology of that species and what techniques will be most effective and when in controlling them. This also helps you protect desirable species that you have on your landscape too. So here's just an example of one of the resources we use when it comes to managing invasives. It's a quick reference guide, and this ties into the phenology of the species. So when are they blooming? When are they fruiting? When are they dormant? These are all things that you need to take into consideration when you're about to start managing invasives, because certain techniques are less effective at certain types of year or at certain life stages for invasives. So understanding the life cycle and their phenology will help you select the most effective technique that there is out there. For example, right now we're about to go into fall and winter. A lot of woody invasive species are about to go into their dormant state where they're pulling all those resources into their root system and they're no longer funneling it out to the leaves. So in winter, a lot of what we do are called cut stump treatments, where we cut the tree down and we treat the stump. That is not as effective throughout the growing season. While it still can be, it is most effective in winter. So understanding phenology helps you pick out control techniques. Prioritizing where to start with invasive control is another big thing to kind of mentally tackle when you're looking at managing invasives. If you have a stand of buckthorn on your property, it can be really tempting to just look at the epicenter of it, the real big thicket of it, and want to tackle it where it's worst, right? Because you're thinking, well, that's the epicenter, that's the nest, that's where it's spreading out from. In fact, it's actually more effective for your landscape, that ecosystem, if you start away from that core zone. You want to focus on those outlier, those satellite infestation populations first, because those are what are going to become your next epicenters, your next core infestation zones. So focus on removing invasive species on your property from areas where you still have other desirable species growing, and those invasives haven't really had a chance to spread to the detriment of those other species yet, and work your way towards that core zone over. Also important to note that your technique that you may be using may change as you get closer and closer to those core zones. You may be using techniques that are much more selective when you're focusing on those outlier properties in order to, those outlier infestations in order to avoid collateral damage to native species. And then maybe you'll be switching to more larger scale forestry mowing or brush mowing, broadcast spraying, etc., towards that core infestation where the risk for collateral damage is less. Mentioned a couple of these already, but control methods are the next thing. When you know what you have out there, you understand the species, what will be effective in managing them, your next step is to look at your menu of options when it comes to control. And there are a lot of things out there, and what you select is dependent on experience, dependent on your time and the resources you have available. So we've got a lot of mechanical techniques that we use, from mowing to chainsaws to using hand saws and loppers. Prescribed burning is an option too if you have the resources available to you. Grazing, chemical control is a big part of invasive species management, and ultimately we use a combination, kind of a mixed cocktail of control methods to effectively control invasive species. And the selection, as I mentioned, it's going to depend on the degree of the infestation, what you're dealing with, what species, the methods that are most effective for that particular species, available budget you might have. Can you contract out this work to someone else, or are you going to be handling it yourself? And the potential for collateral damage. Again, if you have a lot of desirable, nice native species growing near these invasives you're attempting to control, you're probably not going to go in there with a large-scale brush mowing or large-scale foliar spraying of herbicide technique. It's going to be much more selective. Now, onto the good stuff, the meat and potatoes. Common backyard invasives that we envision that most of you have seen or are potentially considering managing. We've broken it down into two categories. We're not going to go into every single species here because we're entering into fall and winter, so we mainly wanted to focus on talking about a couple of the woody species, since that's what most fall and winter invasive management focuses on are the woody species. Those are just some on the right herbaceous invasive species that you're likely to see on your property and deal with. And maybe we can do another video or presentation in the spring that focuses on these, but we'll just talk about a couple of the common backyard woody invasive species that most people are trying to manage. First up being buckthorn. Most of us know this one. Most of us have seen it. It's been on our landscape for quite some time, and it's here to stay, but we can definitely eradicate it from our properties if we come up with effective management plans. So buckthorn, it's dioecious species, so there's male and female trees. The female trees are the ones that produce those dark berries that you see there in the bottom picture. We do have two species, common buckthorn and glossy buckthorn. Both are invasive. The glossy buckthorn you're more likely to find in wetland settings, but they are tall shrubs or small trees. They can reach 20 to 25 feet in height, 10 inches in diameter. We've honestly seen bigger. Their bark is pretty distinguishable. It's a dark color, gray to brown, with these very obvious lenticels, these little white dashes or dots. Those are lenticels on the tree's bark where it exchanges gases with the outside atmosphere. And the other way, if you're unsure that you're dealing with buckthorn, you can actually take like your pocket knife or something, your saw, and just kind of scratch the outer layer of the bark off. And if you see a neon orange color like that, that's an indication that you've got buckthorn. You can also look for the false thorns as pictured on the bottom right. And the leaves are a really waxy kind of deep green color, nice and rounded too, with subtle little serrations, kind of like teeth along the edge. As for control, one of the most effective treatments for buckthorn is just a cut stump treatment. This is something that phenologically is the most effective to use on buckthorn November through February. So this involves manually cutting a tree with a chainsaw or a handsaw, low to the ground, and then applying a chemical application on top of that stump to the outer layer of the cane beam. Picture on the bottom there with a little blue dye on top of a stump, that's someone applying a dabber method of herbicide application to a stump. So when it comes to choosing chemical for cut stump treatment, you do have two options. You could use the active ingredient of glyphosate, or you could use triclopyr. We prefer to use the triclopyr, so we use Garlon 4 mixed with bark oil to conduct cut stump treatments. There are differences here though. With glyphosate or Roundup, you need to be applying that almost immediately after you cut that stump, like right away. That's mixed with water, so it doesn't penetrate as easily into the stump. If you're using something like a triclopyr with bark oil, you've got a little bit more time. Research shows even up to 2 weeks. I would never really wait that long, but you don't have to be in as much of a rush to apply it to the stump right after cutting. And with that bark oil, it really sucks in and down into the roots a lot easier than the glyphosate mixed with water can do. And there are non-chemical methods to treating a stump after cutting. We haven't used this, but I have seen it used. It's called the Buckthorn baggie. Essentially just very thick, heavy-duty black plastic that people zip tie around the base of a cut stump, so that stump will resprout, but those resprouts won't have access to sunlight within that bag. So over time, it just kills off the tree. So that's a non-chemical method you can use. But if you're going to cut a stump, it is essential that it is treated. And that's why chemical is so important, because one buckthorn cut stump that was once one tree can turn into 50 resprouts from one base of a stump. So it's essential to do some sort of treatment on cut stumps. Then we also do foliar applications. So this involves filling something like a backpack sprayer with chemical, and you're applying the chemical to the leaves, the foliage directly. This is a control technique that is most effective June through October. So throughout the active growing season and just before, leaf off or fall dormancy. So we use this on saplings or resprouts, most of the time things that are less than 4 feet tall, because for safety reasons, you don't want to be spraying herbicide over 4 feet in the air. So in a situation like that picture to the right, where there's a lot of little itty bitty buckthorns, that's kind of an area where you would be appropriately using a foliar spray method. Same chemicals that we referred to earlier with cut stump, the active ingredients at least, but they can be used with foliar applications as well. And then non-chemical methods. So sometimes you can pull buckthorn seedlings out of the ground if you've got nice wet conditions, and you're not going to be causing any kind of major soil disturbance. You can also use weed wrenches. That's what the orange tool there is on the right. Mowing, large-scale mowing. So if you have a DR brush mower and you've got smaller buckthorn thickets, you could do that. Prescribed fire. We're not going to go into too much detail about this because there's a lot of resources out there. But if you're using chemical methods, it's always absolutely crucial to make sure that, one, you've definitely read the label, you know what you're using and where and how you should be using it, and always seek out additional help if you have questions. Honeysuckle is like the sister species to buckthorn. It's our other notorious woodland woody invasive species, and it's also one that we see all over private property. So honeysuckle is absolutely a shrub. It never grows into tree form. It's multi-stemmed at the base. There's a picture of the base of a honeysuckle here. You can tell the blonde is really the bark is really blonde compared to buckthorn. It often peels and strips away a little bit. It has a very fragrant, beautiful bloom in the summer and then red berries later into the fall and the winter. But control is almost identical for honeysuckle. It's identical to buckthorn pretty much. However, the main difference being when you're approaching foliar treatments for honeysuckle, so spraying it when it's leafed out in the summer, it is most effective to use glyphosate. The triclopyr is not as effective on honeysuckle. And we tested this out again this growing season and found that the honeysuckle seemed to be able to fight through the sickness that was caused by the triclopyr, but it never actually died. So glyphosate is your option for foliar applications on honeysuckle. And then with non-chemical methods, pulling can be really effective and easy with honeysuckle as long as you can get the entire root crown out. But other than that, this is pretty much, if you're managing buckthorn, you already know how to manage honeysuckle. Just make sure you understand that with the foliar applications, your chemical selection will be different for control. Here are a couple other notorious party crashers, we like to call them. So these are other invasives that we see all over people's private properties that escape into parks. And these aren't all of them, but these are just some of the main ones. One of them being Japanese barberry. It's a really beautiful shrub, but it's highly invasive when it escapes. And please, everybody should just know that you might tell yourself, well, it's in my mowed lawn. There's no way it's going to move anywhere. Animals eat seeds. Animals help to disperse these species. So that's a lot of what happens with barberry is wildlife feed on the berries, as you can see there, and you're probably seeing them fruited right now out in the parks or in your landscape, and they make their way out of your mowed lawns. But they produce thousands, and this is a species that can pretty easily be controlled by cut stump method. And it can also be foliar sprayed, but it's a pain for us to deal with. We spend a lot of time managing barberry, and it's got little thorns on it. So when you're doing cut stump, you're usually getting tagged and scratched up by the thorns. So this is a species that we definitely should move away from utilizing in private landscapes because there's a lot of other great native options we can use. The other species here in the middle, this is wayfaring tree. Wayfaring tree is kind of a newer one in the sense that it hasn't become a huge issue in too many areas, but it's one of those species that we are concerned of it becoming the new buckthorn or honeysuckle in some of our natural areas. It has a very velvety-like leaf, which you can almost see in this picture. The bloom is a really pretty white umbel flower, but the bud on the wayfaring tree is really what stands out. It's a naked bud, it's tan, and it looks really, really velvety. Nothing else is really going to look like that, but it produces a red fruit too, which you might be seeing now. This is one, can be managed the same way buckthorn can, at least with cut stump methods. It's a species though, because of the really hairy leaf, just as if you were managing a species with a very waxy kind of rubbery leaf, you would probably want to use something called a surfactant with any foliar applications you were doing. That just helps the chemical pull into leaves with a really thick cuticle over them, or like, you know, pubescence like this leaf has. It looks really hairy. The chemical would need that help kind of penetrating the leaf because of that. And then last but certainly not least, this one has become a real problem. This is winged burning bush on the right there. They're called burning bush for the right reason. They are just flame pink and flame red in fall, so very aesthetically pleasing, but you can see on the stems there that there's this corky winging. That's what identifies this as the invasive winged burning bush, this also known as winged euonymus. We have several native species of euonymus. We have eastern wahoo, and there's also another invasive spindle tree, but distinguishing between them, that can be something that you look into a little bit further, but between the berries and the leaves, the winged burning bush is the only one with stemming like this, that corky winged stemming. Again, cut stump treatment, identical to the buckthorn, honeysuckle, what you would use on the barberry and the wayfaring tree. You can also do foliar applications, but I think for this particular species, we found if you can just cut stump the large ones, that's probably the most effective route to go. And then we had some kind of trials this year where the triclopyr didn't look too effective on it for foliar resprout treatment. So this may be one that glyphosate may be more effective for, just like the honeysuckle. So that was just to look into a couple of the common ones in our backyard landscapes. And we just want to mention that we can become pretty obsessed easily with, controlling and removing invasives on our landscapes. But we have to remember the essential last step to all of it, which is restoration of native plants. So there's a lot of resources out there for selecting what native species you can put back onto your landscape, depending on where you are in the state. We have a lot of locally known seed vendors and tree and shrub vendors, Johnson's Nurseries, Agricol, that you can select native species for, but there's a lot out there. But just to shoot out a couple here, for natives to replace honeysuckle or buckthorn on your landscape, look at a lot of our native dogwoods. Look at elderberries, witch hazels, musselwoods, American hazelnuts, American filbert, ninebark. There's a lot of options out there that can provide you with the same structure that these invasive species may be providing and occupying on your landscape, but you can get rid of them and you can put natives in there. You're going to see a lot more wildlife, and trust me, they're just as, if not more, aesthetically pleasing than non-native species. Excuse me. So for resources here, as I mentioned, this could have been a 2-day field course. So there's going to be some additional homework to do in terms of looking into more information. But we will accept questions and answers, at the end of this, and hopefully post kind of a live Q&A at some point. But the Midwest Invasive Plant Network is a huge resource for us here at the Parks Department. You can search for individual invasive species, and it will provide you with every single research control technique out there, including the chemicals and how effective they are within each season and the following year. And it also can be filtered based on your experience levels. So you can tell this system, I'm a novice, I haven't done much of this, and it will let you know which techniques are most appropriate for someone that doesn't have a lot of experience with managing invasives yet. CWISC is our, it's a nonprofit, the Southeastern Wisconsin Invasive Species Consortium. This is our cooperative weed management unit for Southeastern Wisconsin. Their website is an amazing resource for invasive species identification, as well as more information on control techniques. And then obviously the Wisconsin DNR and NR40, all of those resources are on their website as well. And that is also where you can report any unique invasive species that you think you might have on your property. So at this time, that concludes our basically overview of what it takes to start busting backyard invasive species. We are going to end the presentation here, and if there's anybody that's logged on to the presentation, we'll take questions live right now. But for anyone that is watching this at a different time, please feel free to send any questions that you have to my email here, and Sam and I will we'll collect all of those questions, and perhaps we'll do a Q&A video at a later date. But thank you. Let's see. Okay, I don't know if I can stop recording. Okay, I did it. Stop recording.